A gang of ruthless criminals kidnaps a quiet town librarian, thinking she'll be easy leverage to seize her library's historic land. But Evelyn Graves isn't just a librarian. She's a retired Black Ops legend with a talent for dismantling entire empires. Now trapped in their warehouse, Evelyn isn't panicking, she's planning. What starts as an act of intimidation quickly spirals into chaos as their helpless hostage turns the tables, exposing a web of corruption far bigger than they imagined. Lives are at stake, and Evelyn's deadly past is about to come roaring back. Before we dive into this action-packed story, buckle up, get ready, and hit that subscribe button, because tomorrow a special surprise is heading your way. The morning light filtered through the tall, arched windows of the library, casting soft golden beams across the polished wooden floors. Evelyn Graves moved silently between the shelves, her sensible shoes barely making a sound. She loved these. Early hours, the quiet hum of the fluorescent lights and the faint scent of old paper. This was her sanctuary, a place where she had carefully constructed a life far removed from the chaos she once knew. She ran her fingers across the spines of books, straightening one slightly out of line. Order and quiet, the two things she craved most. The bell above the front door jingled, signaling the arrival of Mrs. Abernathy, a regular patron who came to borrow romance novels and chat about local gossip. Evelyn smiled warmly and nodded as Mrs. Abernathy chatted on about the town council's latest squabble. Evelyn listened politely, responding with soft hums and nods where appropriate. Her calm demeanor made her a trusted figure in the small community, someone who was approachable yet never intrusive. Most saw her as the sweet, unassuming librarian who never raised her voice and always knew where to find the right book. But beneath the surface, Evelyn's mind was never at rest. Every person who walked through the library doors was assessed in an instant. Height, weight, demeanor, potential threats. She couldn't help it. Her instincts were ingrained after years of survival. She had tried to suppress that side of herself, tried to forget the things she'd done, but old habits clung to her like shadows. Even now, as Mrs. Abernathy turned to leave, Evelyn's eyes flicked to the door and caught the reflection of someone, lingering just outside. Her pulse quickened, but she kept her breathing steady. Nothing was out of the ordinary yet. The rest of the day passed quietly, the usual rhythm of returns and checkouts. By evening, the library was empty, save for Evelyn. She locked the doors with practiced precision, pausing to glance down the darkened street before heading back inside. It was then she noticed the subtle sound, a faint scrape of shoes on pavement. Just outside the library window, Evelyn's eyes narrowed. Someone was there. Before she could react further, the lights inside the library flickered, then went out completely. The sudden darkness was suffocating. Evelyn's heartbeat remained steady, her muscles tensing as her mind clicked into action. The front door burst open, and three men stormed in, their faces partially obscured by scarves. One of them, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, pointed a crowbar in her direction. "We're here to talk about the library," he growled, his voice dripping with menace. Evelyn stepped forward calmly, her expression neutral. "Breaking and entering doesn't seem like the best way to schedule a meeting," she said evenly. Her tone seemed to throw them off. One of the men hesitated, but the scarred leader stepped closer, his sneer widening. "You'll do what we say," he snapped, "or things get messy." Evelyn's eyes locked onto his, her face unreadable. The room was silent except for the faint creak of the floor beneath their feet. Deep down, she knew this life she had built, the quiet, the peace, was about to come crashing down. The leader, Scarface, stepped closer, the crowbar resting heavily in his grip. His two lackeys flanked him, their postures tense and uncertain. "This isn't up for debate, lady," he spat. "You'll sell the library's property. Sign the papers, take the money and walk away, or we'll make you regret staying." Evelyn stood perfectly still, her gaze unwavering. She noticed the slight tremble in the youngest thug's hands, the way his eyes darted around the room as If he were expecting something to jump out at him, the second man, larger but slower, shifted his weight from one foot to the other, trying to appear tougher than he was. Scarface, however, was composed, confident. He was used to people folding. When threatened, used to getting his way. "I'm not interested," Evelyn said calmly, her voice cutting through the tense air like a knife. Scarface's grin faded. He raised the crowbar and slammed it against a nearby bookshelf, the crash echoing through the quiet library. Books toppled to the floor, pages fluttering as they landed. The youngest thug flinched, but Evelyn didn't so much as blink. Her calm only seemed to aggravate Scarface further. "You don't understand who you're dealing with," he growled. Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her tone still steady. "No, I don't think you do." Her words struck a nerve. Scarface motioned to the others, and they stepped forward, closing the distance between them and Evelyn. The larger thug grabbed her by the arm, his grip rough, and tried to drag her toward the door. Evelyn didn't resist, her body slack, as she allowed them to haul her out of the library and into the back of a waiting van. The ride was bumpy and tense, the silence broken only by the occasional muttered curses of the thugs. Evelyn sat quietly, her hands resting on her lap, her eyes scanning her surroundings. She noted the faint smell of motor oil in the van, the way the back door latch didn't close completely, leaving a sliver of light visible. Every detail mattered, and Evelyn catalogued them with practiced efficiency. They arrived at a dilapidated warehouse on the outskirts of town. The building loomed in the darkness, its rusted exterior and shattered windows a testament to years of neglect. The men dragged Evelyn out of the van and shoved her into the building, where more thugs were gathered. Victor Kane stood in the center of the room, his tailored suit and polished shoes starkly out of place in the grimy surroundings. He turned as Evelyn was forced to her knees in front of him, his eyes narrowing as he studied her. "This is her?" he asked Scarface, his tone dripping with skepticism. "She's tougher than she looks," Scarface replied, wiping his brow. "But she'll crack." Victor crouched in front of Evelyn, his voice low and oily. "Ms. Graves, I'll make this simple. Sign over the property or things will become unpleasant." Evelyn met his gaze, her expression blank. Her pulse remained steady, her breathing even. She was already working through the details, the exits, the weaknesses. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. The warehouse reeked of damp concrete and stale cigarettes, the air thick and heavy with neglect. Evelyn remained still, kneeling on the cold floor as Victor Kane's eyes bore into her. He was the type who enjoyed power for power's sake, the kind of man who believed control was his birthright. But Evelyn saw through the sharp suit and practiced smirk. He was just another predator who thought himself untouchable. "Look at her," Victor said, his voice calm but edged with disdain. "Does this look like someone who values self-preservation?" Scarface chuckled nervously, but the sound died quickly as Victor straightened and turned back to Evelyn. He crouched again, inches from her face. "You think your little library means something? It's a relic, just like you. Sign the papers, and I might even let you go back to your quiet life. Refuse." He leaned closer, his tone dropping into a whisper. "And I'll burn it to the ground, with or without you inside." Evelyn didn't flinch. She simply stared at him, letting the silence stretch long enough for Victor's patience to falter. He straightened abruptly and waved a hand, dismissively. "Lock her up, let her stew for a while. Maybe then she'll understand her position." Two of the thugs grabbed Evelyn under the arms and hauled her to her feet. She let them, her body loose, unresisting. They dragged her to a small, windowless storage room with a single hanging light bulb and a battered metal chair. Once they had her inside, they shoved her into the chair and shackled her wrists to its arms with rusted cuffs. "Sit tight, Librarian," Scarface sneered before slamming the door shut, leaving her alone in the flickering light. The moment the latch clicked, Evelyn's demeanor shifted. Her breathing remained controlled, but her eyes began scanning the room with precision. The chair groaned slightly under her weight, and she tested the cuffs. They were old, their hinges worn. The faint scrape of crumbling plaster caught her attention, and she glanced at the wall behind her. A small crack ran along the base, the kind of structural flaw that could be useful later. She counted to 10 slowly, letting her captors believe she was resigned. Then with a sharp exhale, she twisted her wrists just enough to test the cuffs again. The rusted metal bit into her skin, but gave slightly under pressure. She wasn't ready to break free yet. Too soon, too risky. But knowing the restraints were weak gave her an edge. The thugs' muffled voices carried through the thin walls. They were arguing about her, about Victor, about money. Evelyn listened carefully, picking apart their words. One of them, the younger man, sounded hesitant, almost regretful. Weak links could be exploited. She closed her eyes for a moment, her mind reaching back to a time she'd worked in worse conditions, under greater threats. She remembered the feel of cold metal in her hands, the rush of adrenaline as she turned impossible odds in her favor. That part of her, the part she'd buried, was stirring again. When the door opened hours later and Scarface entered to gloat, Evelyn looked up at him, her expression calm. He had no idea that every moment he left her alive, she was drawing closer to his undoing. The door slammed shut behind Scarface, his heavy boots echoing off the concrete walls as he approached Evelyn. His face twisted into a sneer, but Evelyn's expression remained placid, her eyes watching him with unsettling calm. He waved a set of papers in front of her face, the sound of rustling pages filling the tense air. "These," he barked, slamming the papers onto the rickety table beside. "This are your ticket out of here. Sign them, and maybe we'll let you keep breathing. Kane's a generous man. He'll make sure you're well compensated." Evelyn tilted her head slightly, her wrists still cuffed to the chair. "Compensation for what? Watching you destroy a place that means more to this town than you ever will." Scarface's sneer faltered for a split second, but he quickly replaced it with anger. He grabbed the back of her chair and yanked it forward, the metal legs screeching against the floor. "You think you're clever, huh? You think sitting there quiet and smug is gonna save you?" He leaned in close, the stench of stale tobacco on his breath. "Lady, you don't know who you're messing with." Evelyn stared at him, unblinking. "Neither do you." Her words were quiet, but they carried a weight that made Scarface hesitate. For a moment, he seemed unsure of what to say, his confidence chipped by her calm defiance. He straightened, muttering something under his breath, and stormed out of the room, slamming the door behind him. Evelyn exhaled slowly, her pulse steady as she listened to his footsteps fade down the hallway. Alone again, she turned her focus back to her restraints. She rotated her wrists carefully, feeling the cuffs grind against the grooves she'd already worn into the rusted metal. The chair creaked as she shifted her weight, testing its stability. The frame was sturdy, but the bolts holding it together were loose, a weakness she could exploit when the time was right. Her mind drifted back to another time, another room. She could still feel the oppressive heat of the desert, the acrid stench of sweat and fear clinging to the air. She remembered the faces of her team, each one etched with determination as they waited for her signal. Back then, she had been their leader, the one who could think 3 steps ahead when the odds were stacked against them. Every mission had been a game of survival, every moment a test of her resolve. That life felt distant now, like a story belonging to someone else. She had buried it beneath the quiet rhythm of her days at the library, the safety of routine and anonymity. But as she sat in the flickering light of the storage room, the echoes of that past began to rise within her. The instincts she had tried to suppress were coming back, sharper and more precise than ever. She glanced at the crack in the wall behind her, the faintest trace of a plan forming in her mind. This wasn't just about escape anymore. It was about strategy, about waiting for the exact moment to strike. Kane and his men thought they had her cornered, but Evelyn knew better. She wasn't trapped with them. They were trapped with her. Hours passed in silence, broken only by the distant rumble of voices and the occasional clang of metal. Evelyn sat motionless, conserving her energy as she studied every sound, every vibration, every movement outside the room. The storage room's weak bulb flickered intermittently, casting brief moments of shadow that Evelyn welcomed. Darkness was her ally, and she would need every advantage to tip the odds in her favor. The first opportunity came when a new face opened the door. One of the younger thugs, no older than 20, his inexperience written all over his face. He carried a tray of food, his hands shaking slightly as he set it on the table beside her. Evelyn watched him carefully, noticing the way his eyes darted between her and the cuffs. "They said to keep you fed," he mumbled, avoiding her gaze. Evelyn didn't respond immediately, letting the silence stretch just long enough to unnerve him. Then she spoke, her voice soft but deliberate. "What's your name?" The young man hesitated, his brow furrowing. "Why do you care?" She leaned back slightly in the chair, the cuffs clinking softly against the metal arms. "Because you don't look like someone who belongs here." His jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he muttered something under his breath and turned to leave. Evelyn let him go, but not before noting the faint crack in his composure. He was scared, uncertain, a crack she could widen when the time came. Once the door was shut and the lock clicked into place, Evelyn turned her attention to the food. Not because she was hungry. She had learned long ago how to function on minimal sustenance, but because the tray itself was a tool. The utensils were plastic, useless for breaking the cuffs, but the flimsy tray had sharp edges where the material had been molded. She shifted her weight, twisting her wrists enough to reach the tray's edge with her fingers. Slowly, methodically, she began to work on the cuffs, scraping the rusted hinges to weaken them further. The next opportunity came hours later, when the power in the building flickered and dimmed. A brief outage, likely caused by the building's shoddy wiring, left the hallway outside her room in darkness. Evelyn smiled faintly to herself. A test run. By the time Scarface returned, she had already sabotaged the light bulb in the storage room, leaving it hanging dead in its socket. The room was bathed in shadow, and when he opened the door, he cursed under his breath. What the hell happened to the light? Evelyn didn't answer, keeping her breathing steady as he stepped closer. He didn't notice the way her body tensed, didn't see the faint smile that flickered across her lips as he leaned in to inspect the cuffs. "You getting comfortable yet?" he sneered, oblivious to the jagged piece of tray hidden against her. Evelyn remained silent, her fingers tightening around her makeshift weapon. The moment was close, and she was ready. Every second she stayed here, every second they underestimated her, she gained the upper hand. The game had begun. Scarface left the room muttering about fixing the light, slamming the door behind him with a force that made the walls tremble. Evelyn sat back, her eyes adjusting to the dim glow seeping through the cracks in the doorframe. The jagged edge of the tray in her hand was slick with rust, but it had done its job. The hinges on the cuffs were now barely holding together, weakened to the point that one sharp tug would free her. She resisted the urge to act immediately. Timing was everything, and she wasn't ready to make her move. Not yet. The muffled conversations of the gang filtered through the thin walls as Evelyn sharpened her focus. Words like shipment, cleanup, and blueprints floated into her consciousness. They weren't just here to pressure her for the library's land, they were hiding something far bigger. Evelyn's mind began piecing it together, drawing from years of experience analyzing criminal networks. The library wasn't just inconvenient, it was a threat. She leaned her head back against the chair, letting her thoughts flow. The library was old, its foundation one of the oldest structures in the town. If Kane wanted it gone, there was a reason that went deeper than property value. A memory surfaced. A man in a suit visiting her library months ago, asking peculiar questions about the archives and zoning laws. She'd thought nothing of it at the time, but now it clicked. There was something beneath that land, something Kane needed buried. Her musings were interrupted by the sound of boots approaching again. This time, it wasn't Scarface, but Victor Kane himself. The door opened, his silhouette framed by the dim light in the hallway. He stepped inside, his polished shoes tapping against the floor, and closed the door with an unsettling sense of control. "Well, Miss Graves," he began, his voice oozing with false civility. "I was hoping you'd come to your senses by now." Evelyn tilted her head, feigning disinterest. "And I was hoping your people would stop pretending they know what they're doing." Victor's smile didn't waver, but his eyes darkened. He crouched slightly, bringing himself closer to her level. "You're playing a dangerous game. Do you really think anyone will care about you or your library when this is over? People forget. Towns move on. But me, I'm untouchable." Evelyn let his words hang in the air, watching the arrogance ripple through him like a shield. He was so sure of himself, so certain she was broken. He didn't see her calculating every word, every gesture. "Untouchable," she repeated softly, letting the word roll off her tongue. Her gaze locked with his, and for the first time, Victor's confidence flickered. He straightened, brushing non-existent dust from his suit. "I'll give you one last chance. Sign the papers, and this ends. Quietly, otherwise—" He gestured vaguely, his smile returning. "You'll regret it." Victor left, leaving the room steeped in tension. Evelyn flexed her fingers, her thoughts sharp and clear. He had given her all the confirmation she needed. Beneath the library lay something he would kill to keep hidden. Now, it wasn't just about survival. It was about finding out what Victor Kane was so desperate to bury and tearing his entire operation apart piece by piece. Evelyn moved quickly once the door closed and the lock clicked into place. She twisted her wrist sharply, the rusted cuffs snapping open with a faint metallic groan. The relief was instant but fleeting. She couldn't waste time savoring her small victory. Every moment counted now. Quietly, she stood and stretched her stiff muscles, taking stock of her surroundings. The storage room was sparse, but she eyed the exposed wiring in the ceiling and the cracked plaster walls. Weak points everywhere. She just needed the right opportunity. She slipped the jagged edge of the tray into her waistband and approached the door, pressing her ear against the cool surface. The gang's voices filtered through, raised in heated debate. Scarface was yelling about needing more. Meanwhile, Victor's tone cut through with cold authority, insisting they stick to the plan. Evelyn caught the word shipment again, followed by midnight, and filed it away. Stepping back from the door, she scanned the walls and spotted the ventilation duct near the ceiling. It was small, but she could fit through if she removed. The grate. She climbed onto the chair, bracing herself carefully, and pried the grate loose with the tray edge. The screws gave way with minimal resistance, and she eased the metal cover down before hoisting herself into the narrow duct. The space was cramped, the metallic interior creaking faintly with every movement. But Evelyn's training had prepared her for worse. She crawled forward slowly, her breathing controlled, as the muffled conversations below grew louder. The ducts carried sound well, amplifying their arguments. "She's gonna crack," Scarface said, his voice carrying a mix of frustration and doubt. "She's a librarian," another voice replied, one of the younger men. "How hard can it be? Not just a librarian," Scarface snapped. "You didn't see her eyes, man. Something's off about her." Victor's voice cut in, sharp and dismissive. "It doesn't matter. She has no power here. Once the shipment's through, this place will be nothing but ash, and she'll be a footnote." Evelyn's jaw tightened. Ash. They weren't just planning to destroy the library. They were planning to erase any trace of what was buried beneath it. The shipment must be tied to whatever they were hiding, and the midnight timeline meant She had hours, not days, to act. Reaching an intersection in the duct, Evelyn paused, listening for movement. Below her, the voices were closer now. She peered through the slats of a vent and saw a large open space, a makeshift command center with maps, blueprints and computer monitors glowing faintly in the dim light. She caught glimpses of the libraries, layouts spread across the table, red circles marking key points. Carefully, she positioned herself above the table, noting where the men were standing. They were distracted, arguing among themselves. Evelyn smirked faintly. She would use their chaos against them. It was time to sow doubt and fear, to turn their own paranoia into a weapon. They had made the mistake of assuming she was their prisoner. Now she would make them regret every second they left her alive. Evelyn moved swiftly through the ventilation system, careful to keep her movements silent as she tracked the gang's activity below. The command center had given her a glimpse of their operation. Maps, blueprints, and logistics, but she needed more details before making her next move. The vents carried the sound of their voices, amplifying the tension that hung heavy in the air. The gang was growing restless, and Victor's grip on control was starting to crack. Dropping down into an empty storage room, Evelyn landed silently, crouching low as she scanned her surroundings. Crates lined the walls, some marked with nondescript labels, others left open to reveal firearms and other equipment. It was a stockpile, the kind that pointed to a larger operation than just intimidating one librarian. Evelyn approached the nearest crate and quickly rifled through its contents, pulling out a burner phone buried beneath a layer of rags. The screen lit up, displaying a list of recent messages and coordinates. The shipment. Midnight. A warehouse. Across town, Evelyn's mind worked rapidly, piecing the clues together. The library wasn't just a target, it was the center of their operation. Whatever was buried beneath it tied into the larger network of weapons, contraband, and corruption. Victor was managing. She needed proof to expose him. But first, she had to derail their timeline. As she pocketed the phone, a faint noise behind her made her freeze. Heavy boots approached, the rhythm deliberate and searching. Evelyn pressed herself against the shadows, gripping the jagged tray edge she had kept with her. The door creaked open, and one of the thugs stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the dark. He was muttering to himself, complaining about being sent to check the storerooms. Evelyn waited, her breathing steady, her body coiled like a spring. The man stepped closer, his back to her, as he swept his flashlight over the crates. In one fluid motion, Evelyn moved, disarming him with precision and wrapping her arm around his throat in a chokehold. He struggled, his movements frantic, but Evelyn held firm until his body went limp. Lowering him quietly to the floor, she retrieved his radio and earpiece, slipping them into her pocket. She exited the room and slipped into the shadows of the main hallway. The radio buzzed faintly with voices, the gang's conversations chaotic and overlapping. Scarface was shouting orders, demanding tighter patrols, and accusing his men of slacking off. Evelyn smirked. The cracks were widening, and it wouldn't take much to send the whole operation spiraling into disarray. Evelyn moved like a ghost through the warehouse, disabling security cameras, locking doors, and planting small but disruptive traps in critical areas. Loose wires were tucked under rugs, crates were stacked precariously, and equipment was subtly sabotaged. Each act was deliberate, designed to create maximum confusion without drawing immediate attention to herself. By the time she reached the command center, chaos was already taking root. Scarface was arguing with another lieutenant, both accusing each other of mishandling their responsibilities. Victor's voice cut through the shouting, demanding order, but his frustration was palpable. Evelyn smiled faintly, watching from the shadows. They thought they were in control, but she had already turned their own operation against them. The clock was ticking toward midnight, and Evelyn knew she had to move quickly. But for now, the seeds of doubt and fear were taking hold. She would make them unravel, one piece at a time. Evelyn crouched in the shadows near the command center, her eyes scanning the blueprints spread across the table. Red circles marked the library's foundation, with lines radiating outward to nearby streets and buildings. Beside them lay a detailed schedule for a shipment, coordinates, arrival times, and a list of coded items that Evelyn suspected were weapons or contraband. Everything Victor Kane was working toward hinged on this night, and Evelyn intended to destroy it. Slipping away unnoticed, she navigated the maze of hallways, her movements silent and deliberate. The stolen radio crackled with updates as the gang scrambled to deal with the disruptions she had already caused. Cameras were down, doors mysteriously locked, and key equipment had malfunctioned. Tensions were boiling over, and Evelyn could hear Scarface's voice barking orders, each more frantic than the last. "What do you mean the cameras are fried?" he growled over the radio. "Fix it, now!" The lackeys stammered excuses, but Evelyn wasn't listening for their words. She was focused on their locations, piecing together where everyone was stationed. The command center was heavily guarded, but other areas were vulnerable. She needed access to their comms system and a way to escalate the chaos. Evelyn found what she was looking for in a storage closet near the main power hub, a stack of old walkie-talkies left forgotten in a corner. She pulled one free, adjusted the frequency to match the gang's radio chatter, and attached it to a timer she fashioned from a broken clock she'd found earlier. Once set, she placed the walkie-talkie in the ductwork above the command center and moved quickly to her next objective. Minutes later, the timer went off, flooding the gang's radios with static and overlapping voices. The disruption was instantaneous. Scarface's furious shouts mixed with confused demands for clarification. Evelyn smirked as she heard them scrambling, their already fragile organization collapsing under the pressure. She made her way to the power hub, bypassing a distracted guard who had abandoned his post to respond to the chaos. The hub was an outdated panel of switches and breakers, wires tangled like vines. Evelyn quickly identified the critical circuits, the ones controlling the command center's lights and the surrounding security systems. With careful precision, she disabled them, plunging half the warehouse into darkness. The resulting panic was immediate. Shouts echoed through the building, boots pounding on concrete as the gang tried to regroup. Evelyn moved through the shadows, using the confusion to her advantage. She planted small incendiary charges near key points, enough to disable equipment and create more havoc without risking a full-blown explosion. Victor's voice cut through the chaos on the radio, sharp and commanding. "Everyone, get to your stations. Find her. She's here somewhere." Evelyn felt a flicker of satisfaction. For the first time, Victor sounded genuinely rattled. She was no longer just a nuisance. She was a threat he couldn't ignore. As midnight approached, Evelyn's plan was in motion. The gang was divided. Their resources stretched thin, and Victor's confidence was crumbling. She wasn't done yet, not by a long shot, but she could feel the balance shifting in her favor. The stage was set for the final act, and Evelyn was ready to bring it all crashing down. Evelyn moved through the warehouse like a shadow, her every step calculated and silent. The gang was in complete disarray, their shouts echoing through the cavernous space as they stumbled through the darkened corridors, desperate to regain control. She could hear Victor barking orders, his voice sharp with frustration, but the cracks in his composure were impossible to miss. The chaos she had sown was spreading like wildfire, and Evelyn was ready to push it to its breaking point. She slipped into the command center, now partially abandoned as the gang focused their efforts on securing the shipment. The monitors lining, the walls flickered with static, the security system crippled by her earlier sabotage. Evelyn quickly scanned the room, her eyes landing on a laptop left open on the central table. She approached it cautiously, her fingers flying over the keyboard as she accessed the files. Blueprints, financial records, shipping manifests. Everything she needed to expose Victor's operation was right there. Evelyn pulled a USB drive from her pocket and began transferring the data, her heart steady even as the muffled sounds of approaching footsteps reached her ears. She glanced at the progress bar. 80%. Not fast enough. The door burst open and Scarface stormed in, his gun drawn. He froze when he saw her, his eyes widening in disbelief. "You!" he snarled, raising the weapon. Evelyn moved before. He could pull the trigger, grabbing the edge of the table and flipping it toward him. The laptop skidded across the surface, narrowly avoiding damage, as the table struck Scarface and sent him staggering back. Evelyn closed the distance in an instant, disarming him with a swift strike to his wrist and driving her elbow into his jaw. He crumpled to the floor, groaning in pain, as Evelyn retrieved the USB drive from the laptop and slipped it into her pocket. More voices echoed down the hall, growing louder. Evelyn grabbed Scarface's radio and spoke into it, mimicking his gruff tone. "She's headed to the east exit. Cut her off." The false directive sent the gang scattering in the wrong direction, buying her precious seconds. She slipped out of the command center and moved toward the loading dock, where the shipment was being prepared. The area was bustling with activity, the gang rushing to load crates onto trucks under the flickering overhead lights. Victor stood at the center of the chaos, barking orders as his men scrambled to obey. Evelyn positioned herself behind a stack of crates, her eyes locking onto the shipment. If she could disable the trucks, she could delay their operation long enough for the authorities to arrive. She crept toward the first vehicle, planting an incendiary charge on the fuel tank. The second truck received the same treatment, her movements swift and precise. As she set the final charge, one of the guards spotted her, shouting an alarm. Evelyn dove for cover as bullets peppered the crates around her, the gang converging. On her position, the charges detonated moments later, engulfing the trucks in flames and sending shockwaves through the dock. Chaos erupted as the gang scattered, shouting orders and scrambling to contain the destruction. Victor's voice cut through the chaos, livid and panicked. "Find her! Now!" Evelyn slipped away in the confusion, her mission nearly complete. The shipment was destroyed, the operation in shambles, and Victor's carefully constructed empire was crumbling before his eyes. But the fight wasn't over. Yet Evelyn still had one final confrontation to face, and she was ready for it. The loading dock was a scene of utter chaos. Flames roared from the ruined trucks, casting eerie shadows on the warehouse walls. The acrid stench of burning fuel mixed with the panicked shouts of Victor's men as they scrambled to salvage what they could. Amid the confusion, Evelyn slipped into the shadows, her mind focused on the final stage of her plan. Victor was on the ropes, but she knew he wouldn't go down quietly. She crept through the labyrinth of crates and machinery, using the noise and smoke as cover. The USB drive in her pocket was her ace in the hole, filled with enough evidence to dismantle Victor's entire operation. But she couldn't let him escape. His arrogance and power had been his armor for far too long, and tonight she would strip him of both. Victor's voice cut through the cacophony, barking orders with a veneer of authority that was quickly unraveling. "Get those fires out! Secure what's left of the shipment!" he shouted, his face flushed with fury. Evelyn stepped into the open, her movements deliberate. "It's over, Victor!" He spun around, his eyes narrowing as he saw her standing there, calm and unshaken. For a moment, disbelief flickered across his face, then he laughed, a hollow, bitter sound. "You think you've won?" he sneered, gesturing at the chaos around them. "You've made a mess, that's all. But I'll rebuild. People like me always rebuild." Evelyn didn't respond immediately, her eyes fixed on him. "Not this time," she said, her voice low but resolute. "I've got everything I need to bring you down. The files, the shipment records, the names of everyone you've bought and sold. When this night ends, you'll have nothing left." Victor's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty, but he quickly masked it with bravado, drawing a sleek pistol from his jacket. "You really think you can walk out of here alive?" Evelyn's gaze didn't waver. "I've survived worse. The tension was electric, both of them standing in the glow of the fires as the chaos unfolded around them. Victor aimed the pistol, his hand steady, but Evelyn moved first. She dove behind a stack of crates as the first shot rang out, splintering the wood where she had stood. Victor pursued her, his footsteps heavy and determined. Evelyn stayed low, her movements swift and precise as she maneuvered through the maze of crates. She needed to draw him away from his men, to isolate him. Another shot rang out, narrowly missing her as she darted into an adjacent corridor. The sound of his footsteps grew louder, and she could hear the anger in his voice as he called after her. "Running won't save you, Graves," he shouted. "You're nothing but a relic, a ghost." Evelyn stopped, her breathing steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. She turned, stepping out from behind cover, and faced him head-on. "Then let's see how you fare against a ghost." Victor raised his pistol again, but Evelyn was faster. She closed the distance between them in a blur of motion, disarming him with a brutal twist of his wrist and driving her knee into his gut. He staggered back, clutching his side, but she didn't relent. Blow after blow landed with precision, each one a reminder that she was far from the helpless captive he had underestimated. Finally, Victor collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Evelyn stood over him, her expression unreadable. She retrieved the USB drive from her pocket and held it up, letting the firelight reflect off its surface. "This is going to every law enforcement agency and journalist I can find. Your days of hiding in the shadows are over." Victor glared at her, his face a mask of defiance. "You think they'll care? People like me always find a way back." Evelyn leaned closer, her voice ice cold. "Not this time." She left him there, broken and defeated, as the sound of sirens echoed in the distance. The sirens grew louder as Evelyn stepped out of the warehouse, the cool night air hitting her like a welcome embrace. Flames still licked at the remains of the trucks, casting the entire area in a flickering orange glow. She moved with purpose, her steps steady, the USB drive secure in her pocket. In the distance, red and blue lights painted the darkness, signaling the arrival of the authorities. She'd made sure they'd come. An anonymous tip sent earlier in the evening had guaranteed it. Behind her, the chaos in the warehouse reached a fever pitch. Victor's men were scattering like rats, some trying to put out the fires, others abandoning the scene entirely. The empire Victor Kane had built was crumbling before his eyes, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Evelyn didn't look back. As she walked toward the main road, a police cruiser sped past her, its tires screeching as it came to a stop outside the warehouse. Officers poured out, weapons drawn, shouting commands as they stormed the building. Evelyn watched from the shadows, her face impassive. She had no intention of sticking around to answer questions. The USB drive was her insurance. With the files she'd extracted, Victor's operation would be laid bare for the world to see. Politicians, law enforcement, and anyone else who had been complicit in his schemes would find themselves exposed. Evelyn had ensured there was no way for Victor to recover, not this time. She made her way to a small diner on the outskirts of town, the kind of place that stayed open late but never drew much attention. Inside, the smell of coffee and grease lingered in the air, and a lone waitress stood behind the counter, flipping through a magazine. Evelyn slid into a booth near the back, her back to the wall, and signaled for coffee. As the waitress poured her a cup, Evelyn reached into her pocket and pulled out the burner phone she'd taken from the warehouse. She dialed a number, 1. She'd memorized years ago and waited as it rang. "Evelyn?" A familiar voice answered on the other end, calm and composed. "It's done," she said simply. There was a pause, then the voice replied, "And the files?" "On their way to every major outlet in the country," Evelyn said, taking a sip of her coffee. "Victor's empire won't survive the night. You could come back, you know," the voice said. "We could use someone like you." Evelyn let out a faint laugh, shaking her head. "I'm done, Mason. This was the last one." "Take care of yourself, Graves," Mason said before the line went dead. Evelyn set the phone down, her fingers tracing the rim of the coffee cup. She stared out the window, watching as the first faint rays of dawn began to break over the horizon. The world was quiet again, the chaos left behind her. For now, at least, she had found peace. But she knew better than most that the world had a way of pulling you back in. As she finished her coffee and left a few bills on the table, she couldn't help but glance over her shoulder as she walked out the door. Old habits die hard after all.